Hello, I'm Riz Khan. Welcome to this special edition of the show. In the hours ahead, the polls will close coast to coast in the US elections, and soon after we may know the identity of the next president of the United States. But on the other hand, we may not. Apart from a recent outlier in Iowa, the opinion polls have remained tighter than a tourniquet, both nationally and in the key swing states that will determine the next occupant of the Oval Office. Now, it would take the skills of a divinator to predict the outcome, so we've assembled a divine group of guests to bring their experience to bear on the task ahead. And we'll even find out how the world of professional wrestling can help us to all understand the political grappling of this election campaign. Between all the speeches, the stunts and the stumbles, it's the numbers that have dominated this election campaign. Predictions and permutations compete with turnout trends on the magic wall of many a politics show. Well, to conjure up some sense from it all, I'm joined by Joe Twyman, a respected pollster who's covered multiple elections, both in the US and the UK. He's co-founder and director of the Delta Poll Consultancy, and he's promised to give us a prediction of his own at the end of the interview. Joe, thanks for making the time. Now, if there was an election for the most overused phrase during this election cycle, the leading candidates would include too close to call and on a knife edge. Now, how would you describe the situation as voters go to the polls?
Well, I would describe it as certainly very, very close. It is impossible to say which particular candidate is ahead because of the situation with the electoral system in the United States. And so the reality is that nobody knows what is going to happen. And anyone who tells you otherwise is probably trying to sell you something. If the polls are wrong in the way that they were in 2020, then Donald Trump will win. If the polls have overcorrected for 2020, then Kamala Harris will win. And if the polls are broadly right, then it's simply too close, because the 7 swing states, which at the previous election were sometimes won by simply tens of thousands of votes, could decide the election again, and they remain swing states that are very close.
Well, Joe, could you put into context how unusual this race is? I mean, I still remember the hanging chads in Florida we had which denied Al Gore victory in the 2000 election. And of course, we only need to go back to 2020 for a close finish.
Yes, that's right. Actually, the last few elections, with the exception really of 2008, they've all been pretty close, and pretty close in the sense of a large number of states going to one candidate, another group of states going to another candidate, and then in the middle, a series of states, sometimes as many as 9, sometimes as few as 6, where the result is very close, and it's that decides the overall outcome. But beyond that, the specific circumstances of this presidential election are unique in many ways. For instance, a situation where we've had 2 attempts on the life of one of the candidates during the campaign. That is unprecedented. But then, of course, the very fact that this is a contest between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is unprecedented, because up until a few months ago, of course, it was Joe Biden. And so to have him drop out so late in the game is unprecedented. And that's why any kind of statistical modelling that takes the snapshot of public opinion of where we are at the moment and tries to extrapolate that to where we will be on election day is very difficult, because it will be based on historical precedents, and there is no historical precedent for the situation we're in this presidential election.
Well, apart from the assassination attempts you mentioned, very news-grabbing, as you recall, what have been the most significant or surprising trends during the final weeks of the campaigning, and how much of an indicator are they, do you think, of the final result?
Well, when you ask the most important questions about what's motivating your vote, what are the most important problems facing the United States, what are the most important problems facing you and your family, we hear time and again that prices, the cost of living and the economy form a top tier of concerns. And then below that, you have things like healthcare, immigration, and abortion and a woman's right to choose. But there is variation among different supporters. If you're a Trump supporter, it's very likely that you'll prioritize immigration as the most important problem facing America. In contrast, Kamala Harris supporters think that prices and the economy is most important, but equally important is abortion and a woman's right to choose. All these factors will have a huge impact, but ultimately, America is hugely divided. There will be relatively few, very few in fact, people switching from Kamala Harris to Donald Trump and vice versa. Instead, what will probably decide this is not people switching from one candidate to the other with their preference, but instead people switching between whether they're going to vote or not. Whether the two different candidates can get sufficient numbers of their supporters to turn out and vote will determine the overall result.
Now, have you been able to learn anything from the millions of people who've turned out to cast their ballots in early voting opportunities?
Well, it's very, very easy to read too much into the early voting. Early voting was up significantly at the last presidential election, but a lot of that was linked with COVID. But it appears to be perhaps even higher on this occasion in some areas, but we're not really sure how that relates to the overall electorate. And so in some areas, Kamala Harris appears to be doing better, and she appears to be doing better among women, and that is something that has played out consistently in the polls. She often has a double-digit lead over Donald Trump among women, but it is early. It is early days. It is only early voting, and people will continue to vote from now until election day, and we won't really know the outcome until late on election day. But it may indeed be a number of days, weeks, or even months after that the overall result is actually confirmed.
I have to say, Joe, there have been plenty of 11th hour moments, from Trump the fascist to Trump the garbage guy and the whole Puerto Rico row. To what degree can such late interventions tip the scale in a close run election like this?
Well, in a close run contest where individual states and their electoral college votes will be decided by potentially only thousands of votes, these kind of interventions can have an important impact. There are some states in the swing state list where more than 1 million people there are from Puerto Rico, of Puerto Rican descent. And so to have their area described as a garbage dump is not going to resonate well. But will that necessarily motivate those people to turn out for Kamala Harris in disgust at Trump, or will Trump supporters stay at home? We really don't know. All the indications are that despite everything that's happened, politics in the United States is what's best described as calcified. People are stuck very much in their positions, and so it suggests there hasn't been a massive amount of movement during the campaign, and yes, there's still time for not just an October surprise, but now a November surprise. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it will have an impact, but it certainly has the potential to have an impact.
It's an interesting analogy saying it's calcified, because it sometimes seems like we're told that the election will be decided by a handful of people in a bar in a Pennsylvania suburb. Now, of course, that's a slight exaggeration, but why do polls matter outside those key swing states? What can they tell us?
Well, there's the question about the popular vote. So in other words, how the country as a whole votes. A Republican has not come top of the popular vote in the United States presidential elections since 1988, with the exception of 2004, when George Bush won, but George W. Bush, I should say. But circumstances were very unusual then because of the war in Iraq. This time, some polls have Donald Trump ahead in the popular vote. If he were to win that, it would be mark extremely successful time for him as a candidate, particularly given all that has happened previously. He didn't win the popular vote at the last election. He didn't win the popular vote in 2016 when he won the presidential vote. And so lots of interesting dynamics going in there. But the polls also help to emphasize to everyone in the United States, be they in safe states or in swing states, it emphasises to them that it is a close race. It will come down to a few thousand votes in some cases. And so everyone should take that information on board and decide whether they are going to vote or not based on the impact that it may have in their particular state.
Now, a number of recent elections in the US, both presidential and congressional, have seen certain groups of voters underrepresented in polls, leading to some surprise results. Now, to what extent has it been possible to correct such miscalculations? And is there a danger of going too far the other way and underrepresenting different groups of voters?
Well, there's certainly a risk. Absolutely, the 2020 presidential election was a bad day at the office for American pollsters. But it's worth pointing out that in a very, very close race, if you're coming down to thousands of votes to determine the result of a state with many millions of people in it, no poll, no matter how good, can determine the outcome there, because all polls are subject to the margin of error. And we cannot abolish the margin of error because it is part of the laws of probability. And we can't abolish the laws of probability in the same way we can't abolish the laws of gravity. And so in a very close race, it is difficult to come up with an overall sense of where we are beyond the margin of error. But having said that, it is the case that certain groups are underrepresented, and that is also a reflection of the fact that the electoral demography in the United States is changing, and it's changing quite significantly in some areas. And so people talk about, for instance, the Latino vote. The Latino vote is made up of very different groups within that, from South American Latinos, Cuban Latinos, Puerto Rican Latinos. All of these have different motivations and have different experiences, and so that can make a big difference. And it's similar with lots of different groups, not least the African American community, and there has been some evidence that younger African American men, for example, are less incentivized to vote for Kamala Harris this time around. But at the same time, that's a group that historically hasn't voted in high numbers at all. And so lots of complicated things going on, and how you deal with that as a pollster or an analyst is complicated at the best of times. But in such a close race, it becomes even more complicated.
I don't envy your job, Joe. And talking of the laws of probability, are you aware of Professor Aaron Lixman's 13 key system by which he's confidently predicted the outcome of US elections seemingly since time began? Now, he has a great track record against the polls, so is there anything you could learn from him?
Well, what I would say is that these tests based on historical factors work up until they don't, and perhaps he could explain how many of his previous election predictions involved a candidate being the victim of an assassination attempt on 2 separate occasions, a vice president taking over from a presidential candidate with only months to go, and indeed one of the lead candidates having previously been taken to the Senate for an insurrection. I mean, it's a very, very unusual election, and any of those individual things that I've mentioned would make this unique. The fact that all of them combine mean that there is no historical precedent, and ultimately it may be right, it may be wrong, but it may come down to the toss of a coin.
Well, very good point. Now, finally, you've dared to tread where many others have shied away and made a bold prediction of your own about the US elections, although it's actually more a cheeky one than bold.
That's right. My prediction is that Donald Trump will declare victory probably around 2 hours after the polls in Pennsylvania close. Now, that's nothing to do with the actual outcome. As I say, I do think it's too close to call. I'm not predicting either way on that. I'm simply predicting in terms of his behavior. I think that part of his strategy will be to claim victory as quickly as possible and then to deal with the consequences after that. Those consequences could be swift, they could be severe, but we simply don't know what will happen. But in the same way that he claimed victory in 2020 and continues to claim victory in 2020, I imagine 2024 will be something that he will claim, and he'll attempt to do that really as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much. Great analysis. Good to have you on the show.
Thank you.
While parties and pundits argue about the poll numbers, there's one thing both have consistently agreed upon, that this is a landmark election. The stomach-churning tension in anticipation of the result was best described by one party supporter as nauseously optimistic. But our next guest is made of stronger stuff. David Frum was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, but won't be voting for Donald Trump. He's a senior staff writer and editor for The Atlantic, and author of books including Trumpocalypse and Trumpocracy. David, thanks for making the time. Now, in your eyes, how significant an election is this? What's at stake?
What's at stake is self-government. The challenging candidate, Donald Trump, tried to overthrow an election in 2021. Nothing like that has ever been seen before, at least in the post-Civil War history of the United States, that a president who attempted a violent coup using the power of the office is now trying to get that office back. That's everything. And along the way, this same president is proposing to upend the entire system of global trade and to wreck the entire system of Western alliances, starting with the guarantees to Ukraine, but the NATO system. It is a direct challenge to democracy at home and to this America's place in the world.
And of course, there's incredible tension around this election. What do you feel the parties have got right and got wrong in their campaigns?
It's hard for me to evaluate this as some kind of sports commentator or some outside observer, because if the coalition that is trying to protect American democracy, to protect global trade, to protect the alliance system is wrong, everything that I personally hold dear goes up in smoke. And if the other side does a good job of manipulating hatreds and inflaming grievances again. So it's a little, I can't be an assessor of the fire department and the arsonist. There's a fire department, there's an arsonist. I wish the fire department well. I hope the arsonist will be stopped.
Well, you know, it's interesting you raise that point because the final weeks of the campaign have served up an almost daily menu of outrage, particularly on the Republican side. It's included claims from former staffers that Donald Trump is a fascist, to Puerto Rico being compared to a garbage patch. And we've seen in the past how the former president seems almost immune to any kind of backlash. So how harmful is that actually to to the Trump campaign?
Look, if all that happened were the former president's senior staffers were calling him names, that would be not so remarkable. It's the basis of the assessment of Trump as a fascist that is alarming. Through his term as president, there were stories again and again from his insiders that he would speak about arresting and executing his opponents. On his own social media platform, he's called for the use of military tribunals against former Congresswoman Liz Cheney and against his own chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we hear now from his former chief of staff that Donald Trump broke promises to pay for the funerals of people he'd murdered, defamed them on the basis of their ethnicity, and again that he was up to his eyeballs in the plot to overthrow the 2021 election. So it's not like Jerry Seinfeld calling a mean-tempered restaurant owner a soup Nazi. It's not a name. It's a description of a behavior.
Now, when it comes down to it, then, is democracy actually on the ballot paper, or is that just an empty campaign slogan?
Constitutional government is on the ballot. As I said, I don't think there's any way to get past this. The last president, the current nominee of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, lost the 2020 election and tried first by fraud and then by violence to overturn that result. Nothing like that has ever been seen, at least in the post-Civil War history of the United States. And he's now going to be offered a chance to try it again. And I think that has to be profoundly unacceptable to anyone who cares about the structure of constitutional democracy. It's not just another campaign issue.
You know, David, the campaign's exposed massive divides across the US by gender, race, education, and ideology. Considering that, how can either candidate hope to reunite the country after such a divisive election?
Well, it's important to understand that the Trump vote is part of it is fanatically committed to Donald Trump, but not all of it. So when you hear that the country is half one way and half the other way, there is an important segment of American public opinion that is committed to the Trump authoritarian project. But a lot of the people who did vote for him and who will vote for him are voting out of habit, out of party identification, out of refusing to accept that it could be as bad as everyone says it is. And so I think it will be possible to have a functioning government of the United States. Joe Biden did operate a functioning political consensus for his 4 years as president.
Well, I guess once the result is in, should we be more worried by a vengeful Trump presidency or a contested Harris victory?
Donald Trump will certainly try to claim a victory, and that project explains a little bit why he had the rally in Madison Square Garden in New York City this past weekend. I mean, it might seem strange. New York is not at all a swing state. There is vanishingly small chance that Donald Trump could win in New York State. So why have a rally there? And the answer is, as many of your viewers will know, the American constitutional mechanism says if there's no winner in the Electoral College, or if you can somehow block the Electoral College, as Trump tried to do on January 6th of 2021, then the election goes to the House of Representatives. The new House will be constituted on the 3rd of January, 2025. So whoever wins the House elections in 2024 will be the ultimate arbiter of the 2024 presidential election. And the area where there are the most seats up for grabs is New York State. And Donald Trump is, I think, hoping that he can win control of the House by winning enough seats in New York State to tip the House of Representatives into the Republican column, and then that he can pressure a reelected Speaker Mike Johnson to deliver him a result if he can simply sabotage the counting of the vote in the Electoral College.
So when it comes down to the race for the Senate, what are your expectations?
The race for the Senate, I think, is a lower stakes election because the Republicans in the Senate are more normal than Donald Trump and the House Republicans. Most experts believe that Republicans are likely to win the United States Senate, but that's a different kind of question. The Senate Republicans have been supportive of open international trade. They have been allied to Ukraine. They have honored America's international commitments. They're not like their counterparts in the House of Representatives, and they're certainly not like Donald Trump.
But to a large degree, it looks like the Republican Party's backed Donald Trump. And what happens, in your opinion, to the Republican Party if Donald Trump loses?
Depends how badly he loses. If Donald Trump loses badly and takes the Republican majority in the House of Representatives with him, and it's a very thin majority, it could easily lose, I think there will be some soul searching in the Republican world. I mean, Donald Trump will have been nominated 3 times. He will have lost 3 times, and not in close elections. In 2016 and 2020, if you look at Donald Trump's share of the vote, not the Electoral College performance, which distorts, but the actual share percentage of votes cast for him, he won fewer votes. He won a smaller share of the vote than Al Gore in 2000, a smaller share of the vote than John Kerry in 2004, a smaller share of the vote than Mitt Romney in 2012, and a smaller share of the vote than Hillary Clinton in 2016. Both times, he won smaller shares of the vote than Gore, than Kerry, than Romney, than Clinton. At some point, the Republicans are going to wake up to the prospect that maybe this is not a winning formula they have here.
You know, David, you've played a major role as a Republican in the White House under a Republican president. And a lot of people are asking, you're openly against Donald Trump, but, you know, again, a lot of people are asking, why has the Republican Party in general stood so solidly behind Donald Trump, despite the various negative issues, such as him even being a convicted felon?
I worry about that all the time. I will say, as you said, I've been active in Republican politics for a long time. I started by knocking on doors as a volunteer for George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan in 1980. I came to Republican politics because I believed in a strong American presence in the world, American leadership of a coalition of democracies. I believed in open trade. I believed in free markets at home. I believed in government that didn't play favorites between one business and another. I believed, of course, in constitutional government and free and fair elections. Everything I believe in is repudiated by Donald Trump. So yes, he uses the old label, but it's a different thing. And to be loyal to the principles that I came into politics to be loyal to, the fact that the label is unchanged, it shouldn't blind me to the fact that the reality is not there. I look to an America that can protect its friends, whose word is good, that presides over free and fair international trade. Donald Trump rejects all of that.
You know, I followed quite a bit of your work, David, and I was intrigued to hear you say that Donald Trump sees himself as the ruler of America as president, when actually he's not. I heard your logic for it, but I'd ask you to explain it for our viewers, please.
Well, um, if a president of the United States walks into the poorest street of the poorest town in America and meets there the poorest resident on the poorest street, that president needs to understand that poorest resident of the poorest street in the poorest town is the president's boss. That person is a voter, and the voters are the boss. The reason Donald Trump is so comfortable with figures like the dictators of Russia and China and North Korea is because he sees himself as not an employee, but as the master. That's why he will do things like throw rolls of toilet paper at hurricane-stricken people in Puerto Rico because he's the master. He's the owner. They are beholden to him. He never sees himself as a public employee, but always as a figure comparable to the dictators of Russia and China.
You know, given the nature of the campaign and the fact that the winner of the popular vote might not win the presidency, as you've pointed out, that it all depends on a few thousand people in one state and it doesn't matter what most people do, what kind of advertisement is this for democracy in what is now, at least for now, still the world's most powerful and influential country?
Well, the United States is a country of great, very conservative institutions. That's why we're not on the metric system. It's hard to bring the United States into the modern age. And the Electoral College has always been an anachronism, and it's become an increasingly dangerous anachronism. So when we get through all of this, I think revising the Electoral College in some way, every other country that has a strong president, notably France, for example, has some system of runoff elections to guarantee that the person who becomes president is indeed the winner of more votes than the person who does not become president. We don't have that mechanism. The mechanism that we have, which was written back in the 1780s, isn't very effective. It's long out of date. So I don't think there's anything wrong with American democracy, but there's some things wrong with the institutions of American democracy that are old and need to be updated.
It wasn't that long ago. No one could have expected Kamala Harris to be running for president. And I've heard you talk about the role of vice presidents in the past and how they've been kind of set to play a complementary role, perhaps, with the existing president. So what do you make of the two vice presidential candidates, J.D. Vance and Tim Walz?
I think if Trump does win somehow, the world should be ready for J.D. Vance to be a very powerful vice president. You can do a lot in the White House as a vice president if you get to the office at 6:30 for a president who doesn't get to the office until noon. I think power will tend to flow from Trump to Vance. Walz is more of a question mark to me. Biden did not use Vice President Harris well, and sometimes vice presidents who are badly used, like Lyndon Johnson was badly used by John F. Kennedy, then in turn mistreat and minimize their own vice president, as Lyndon Johnson, once president, did the same to his vice president, Hubert Humphrey. The job is up whatever the president decides it will be. Most presidents of the past half century have made their vice president an important advisor and have used the vice president to sort of offset some of their own weaknesses. If they were outsiders to Washington, they found a vice president who was an insider to Washington. They use this person whose interest was so closely aligned with their own. We'll see what President Harris does.
Well, the poll numbers have been consistently close in recent weeks, but that doesn't necessarily mean the result will be. So could we still see a landslide for either candidate?
Well, if a landslide means 58, 59% of the vote, the way it did under Ronald Reagan in 1984, Richard Nixon in 1972, then no. Could we see a decisive result? We are living through, and not just in the United States, a crisis of polling, where polls, for a lot of technical reasons, are working less and less well than they did in the 1980s and 1990s. And just go through them. The Brexit result, the 2020 election, which was in the United States, which was where Biden's lead was massively exaggerated by polls. The 2022 congressional elections, where polls predicted a much bigger Republican result than had. There are people who, I won't take the time now to point to the various explanations of why this is so, but everyone needs to understand that if you have a memory that in 1988 or 1998 you could take a poll to the bank, or certain polls, I don't think you can do that anymore.
That's going to be interesting for sure. Now, we've heard your cautions about another Donald Trump presidency, but deep down, who do you expect to win?
I believe in the good sense and good faith of the American people. I believe they care about democracy. I believe they care about their allies. I believe they don't want to pay more for imported goods and don't want to see American exports suffer when other countries retaliate against American goods. So I think they'll do the sensible thing and vote for a balanced government of President Harris, a Republican Senate that'll find the middle way to lead us into a more stable period than we've had in the past decade.
David Frum, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We're going to finish with a rather unusual perspective on the US elections, viewed through the lens of professional wrestling. My next guest is a podcaster, TV producer, and legendary wrestling executive. Well, as he observed the race for the White House, he became increasingly convinced that politics and wrestling are becoming more and more alike. To guide us through all the political character chokeholds and policy arm wrestles, I'm joined by the Wrestling Hall of Famer, Eric Bischoff. Eric, welcome to the show. Now, you've suggested that wrestling is becoming more like politics and vice versa. In what ways do you think that's happening?
Well, it's interesting. About, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, maybe 6, I did a TEDx talk, and I addressed that issue exactly, that politics has become more like professional wrestling than professional wrestling. In that, I think there was a period of time when news media who reported on politics at least attempted to create the perception that they were giving both sides of an issue and encourage the audience, consciously or subconsciously, to think about the information that was being presented and to arrive at their own conclusions. That's gone.
Is it a bad thing?
Media,
but is it a bad thing or a good thing in some ways? I mean, it's a little more raw.
It's a bad thing because politics now it's a reflection of the media in general. And the media in general is now produced to make the audience feel. It's not produced to provide information and encourage the audience to think. It encourages the audience to feel emotionally. And I think when it comes to politics, business, even culture, thinking will probably be a bigger benefit to the human race than reacting emotionally. And the media today is all about encouraging people to react emotionally, whether that's out of fear, primarily it's fear, anger. These are all emotions that are stoked by the media, and politicians have to play into that format in order to get media attention. I wish people would think more about policies and how it affects not only them personally, but the country, wherever they live, and the culture. It's an unfortunate situation, and I think that's why people today are so anxious to express their emotions that have nothing to do with facts or truth.
Well,
that's all based on emotion.
You know, Eric, that brings me on to kayfabe, you know, the fact or convention of presenting stage performances as genuine or authentic, something that's quite common in wrestling. Now, do you think there's an element of this present in the way that politicians conduct themselves?
Of course. And again, here in the United States, we have cable news platforms, all of them. And if you watch them closely, you have your good guy, depending on, your political leanings. And then you have your occasional counterpart or the bad guy in wrestling. You have your baby faces and you have your heels. And the media encourages them to really communicate much like they would if they were professional wrestlers doing a promo backstage or an in-ring interview. It's all conflict, confrontation, good guy, bad guy, and very little facts or relevant truth.
Now, image is a big thing, and to succeed at wrestling, you have to be seen as dangerous, I guess. Is it the same for politics?
I think so. I think so. There are extremes, obviously. Not all politicians are the same. Some are more cerebral than others. Some are more focused on facts and policy and truth, and others are more focused on creating emotion to win over a prospective viewer or audience.
Now, you know, Donald Trump is a hero to some and a villain to others. And I wonder, is it important to be characterized in this way for success in politics or business?
It is, because again, it feeds into the media profiles. It feeds into the media narrative. If a politician were to come out and just talk about policy and talk about facts, it's boring for the average person here in the United States. The average person doesn't want to think. They prefer to get their news from bumper stickers or slogans or T-shirts. That's all the depth of their knowledge is what they consume either in social media, which has its own agendas, or like I say, bumper stickers and slogans. There's very little depth to the knowledge of far too many citizens of all countries, really.
Now, some of the most memorable entertainment moments from the electoral cycle have been by your friend, Hulk Hogan's appearances as Donald Trump's chief cheerleader at the Republican National Convention and at Trump's Madison Square Garden extravaganza. What did you make of his performances?
I'll be honest, I've been friends with Hulk for 25, almost 30 years. And what you're seeing and hearing out of him is very authentic. It's who Hulk Hogan really is. It's how Hulk Hogan really feels. He's not doing it for attention. He's getting a lot of attention, but that's not why he's doing what he's doing. He firmly believes in the things that he's saying. He firmly believes that Donald Trump is the best candidate for president of the United States. And I think for Hulk to be able to use his notoriety and his 40 years of being a public figure to go out and support someone that he believes in. And Hulk is he's very thorough. He understands the issues. He understands the politics. I don't think that Hulk Hogan or anybody that I know agrees with everything that Donald Trump says 100%. But when you cut through all of the bombast and the hyperbole and some of the off the wall things that Trump has to say sometimes, and you just focus on the policies, it is very much rooted in common sense and facts and reality, as opposed to strictly emotion. There's a lot of emotion in what Donald Trump says. Don't get me wrong. Again, any politician who's out there at a very high level has to play into the media, has to do the things and say the things that they know is going to get media attention, good or bad. I think with Donald Trump, what you see is what you get. And I think with Hulk Hogan, he's very much the same.
Well, on that note, Eric, Donald Trump has also appeared on podcasts with wrestling legends such as Tyrus and The Undertaker, while Dave Bautista recorded an anti-Trump video dismissing the former president as a weak baby. What is it about wrestlers and politics?
I think wrestlers are conditioned, trained. Perhaps they have an instinct for self-promotion and a need, quite frankly, to stay visible and try to stay relevant. Doesn't mean that they shouldn't express their opinions. Anybody should be able to express their opinions, whether people like it or not, particularly in a country that prides itself on freedom of speech. So Dave Bautista should, if he's so motivated, have every right to say whatever he feels and believes. But I think with professional wrestlers, often they come out and take positions that are contrary to perhaps other professional wrestlers because, well, it gets them a lot of attention.
Well, actually, the wrestling world was represented in Donald Trump's first cabinet by Linda McMahon, the co-founder of the WWE with her husband Vince. Now, would you answer the call if invited to join a second Trump administration?
Of course I would. I think anybody who is interested in the future, who has something to offer, should provide that service to the United States or to a president, should they be asked. I don't know that if I have any qualifications that would put me on anybody's list, but of course I would.
Maybe clear up your agenda after November. We'll see. Well,
you never know. I could get that phone call. Who knows?
In the wrestling world, the introduction of a new character requires a compelling backstory, and you may need time for fans to get to know and love that character. Now, Donald Trump's backstory is already well known, so how much more of a challenge has it been for Kamala Harris to create and develop that character in relatively a short time?
Well, it hasn't been that short. If you look at it, she's been in the Senate. She had a very high-profile position in the Senate. We've seen her in a lot of the Senate judicial hearings. She's had 4 years as vice president to create her backstory. The problem with Kamala Harris, in my opinion, is that she hasn't done enough. She hasn't been successful in representing anything. She's been an unknown quantity in terms of her positions, her policies. They're all over the map. If you pay attention to U.S. politics, especially this last week going into the election, she was for fracking. Now she was against fracking. Now she's for it. She's against the Second Amendment. Now she's for it. There's nothing that you can point to in Kamala Harris substantively that you can say she has held that position, she maintains that position, she believes in her position, and she's going to fight for it. She doesn't have a backstory because she hasn't created one for herself. She's only been running for president for a relatively short period of time, but she's had a very high-profile position in politics for many, many years. She just hasn't accomplished anything.
Yeah, interesting, Eric. We spoke to an analyst who said actually the position of a vice president depends very much on what the president allows them to do. And some push their vice presidents, as in the case with Reagan and George H.W. Bush and so on, and that perhaps Joe Biden didn't give us that much of a chance. But I wonder, what can politics and politicians learn from the world of wrestling?
To be original, to be authentic, to be unique, to engage with the audience, to understand the audience, to understand what motivates an audience. Those are all things that are absolutely critical for a professional wrestler. When you think about it, a professional wrestler, two professionals go out into the middle of a ring that's essentially 20 foot by 20 foot. They're out there in their underwear, basically, and their jobs are to create emotion, to connect to the audience, to be able to understand what the audience wants to see and wants to feel, wants to experience. So understanding your audience is probably one of the most critical aspects of being a successful professional wrestler. Likewise, I think being a successful politician requires that you understand your constituents, you understand and relate to what motivates them, what scares them, what they aspire for or to be. And I think that's also true with politicians. The ones that do, and I think it's one of the reasons Donald Trump is as successful as he is going into this election with 6 days left. You know, Donald Trump, it may be a multi-billionaire, but he very much connects and relates to the average person, to the middle class. If you look at, for example, the rank and file, the members of some of the most powerful labor unions in the United States are supporting Donald Trump. Why is that? Because he understands them. He relates to them. He connects with them in a way that Kamala Harris, quite frankly, absolutely does not. She relates to the elites. She relates to the ruling class. And it's a really interesting thing that here in the United States, for decades, I'm 69 years old. I've been interested in politics all my adult life. I grew up, fortunately, in a school in Detroit that emphasized current events, civics, social studies, and that created in me just a powerful interest in current events, and politics, of course, being a part of current events.
I have to say, you're looking excellent.
I wish more people were interested in current events and in politics in a real way, not in an emotional, superfluous way.
Well, Eric, you're looking great at 16. I have to say I'm jealous. Now, you're also a respected expert in communications. What do you make of both campaigns? How well are they selling their stories? I mean, you touched on it a bit with Donald Trump, but how well are they getting their messaging out?
I think the Trump campaign is doing an excellent job because they're focusing on policies. I think the Harris campaign is in the position they're in, which is struggling at this point because it's all about emotion. And it's unfortunately so much of their positions and the commentary, the narrative that's coming out of not only Kamala Harris, but her surrogates and the Democratic Party is rhetoric that is not helpful at all. You know, comparing Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler. Well, that's kind of stupid. And when you look at Donald Trump, whose daughter is Jewish, his son-in-law is Jewish, he's got grandchildren who are Jewish. Donald Trump, you know, look what he's done for Israel during the 4 years that he was president, and what he did with Jerusalem, and it to come out and equate Donald Trump with Adolf Hitler, I think is an obvious reflection of just how shallow and ill-prepared Kamala Harris is to discuss policies that people are really interested in. The economy, safety, immigration. Yes, abortion here in the United States is a hot topic, and Kamala Harris definitely has a lead in terms of people who support pro-abortion positions. But most of it is based on lies. Most of her campaign, I've heard her talk about how Donald Trump wants to make, you know, abortion illegal nationally. That is a flat out lie. There's nothing that even resembles truth in that. And when you have to rely on lies and exaggerations and all form of fabrication in order to compare yourself or differentiate yourself to your opponent, I think it's a reflection of a very weak, unstable candidate.
And of course, Eric, the waters are very much muddied by the impact of social media. I mean, we saw Donald Trump on Joe Rogan's podcast with over 37 million when we last checked. I wonder, in your opinion, how the traditional broadcast and print media performed in this election. Are they doing their jobs?
Hell no. Hell no. They're dead and they don't know it. I think within the next 2 election cycles, print media, traditional mainstream, I don't even like to call it media, it's propaganda. And you know what's really interesting? I don't know if you've ever been to a country. I don't know if you've ever been to a country that is ruled by a dictator. I have been. I was in Pyongyang, North Korea for 5 or 6 days. And I was there as part of a group. And we toured all over Korea. And until you're in a country like that, right, one can't possibly understand the implications of government censorship and propaganda. It is unbelievable to experience, particularly for someone who comes from a Western culture, in the United States in particular, where freedom of speech is paramount. It is absolutely amazing, but that's where we're leaning. That's why I think Elon Musk I don't think anybody's done more for the United States of America and its Constitution with regard to freedom of speech than Elon Musk. And he's very controversial, and a lot of people are going to hate me for saying this, but that's okay. I'm used to that, right? Yeah. But the truth is, the federal government, the United States government, censored Twitter as they censor today Google, one of the largest platforms out there. To this very day, if you go, as soon as we hang up the phone, if you go to Google and search for the Joe Rogan Donald Trump interview that 27 million people have seen, they didn't see it on Google, they didn't see it on YouTube because it's been censored. Google, YouTube don't want you to see it. Right. And the reason they don't want you to see it is because Donald Trump made sense and they can't censor him.
Right. You know,
and I think censorship, you know, we talk so much about, you know, here in the States, the Constitution and all the rights that come with it, and they're all very, very important. But without freedom of speech, none of it matters.
Now, Eric, I was going to say,
live in a dictatorship.
with about a minute left, I want to make the most of this to come off that communication stuff. Now, just back onto the wrestling briefly, because I'd love to get your answer on this. Let's imagine the candidates for the US presidential election in a wrestling ring. We have two tag teams, Trump, Vance versus Harris, Waltz. What's the script for that bout, and how does it end, in your opinion?
Oh, I'd have to give that some thought. And I certainly can't do a good job of that in a minute. But the formula for every wrestling match is, you have your good guys and you have your bad guys, and usually the bad guys are the first to attack. They're the first to cheat. It looks like they have the advantage, which is very much like this political cycle. Actually, now that I think about it, good question. But your heels will try to cheat, they'll distort, they'll lie, they'll do whatever they can. And it looks like they're going to come out on top doing so until the very end, when the baby faces, in this case, we'll suggest Trump and Vance, do what we call in the professional wrestling industry, they make their comeback. Just when you thought they were beat, just when you thought they couldn't possibly prevail, they dig down deep and find a way to win. And I think that's where we're at in this political cycle.
Eric Bischoff, what a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Well, we'll have to leave it to the pundits and the pollsters, the politicians and the lawyers to grapple with the election results. In the meantime, watch out for the second part of my election special shows on Al Arabiya News, in which we'll discover how the world could be affected by a Harris or Trump presidency. My guests will explain the potential impact on events in the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, and China, as well as at home in the USA itself. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. And whatever the outcome, we'll see you soon.